Beneath the rainforests of Sumatra, something is waiting, and it's been waiting for years, maybe a decade, storing energy in an underground mass that can grow larger than a full-grown man. And when it finally decides the time is right, it erupts as a tower of burgundy and green, sometimes 12 feet tall, generating its own heat like a living body and breathing out the concentrated stench of a week-old corpse across half a mile of jungle. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're digging into the corpse flower. Its Latin name translates to giant misshapen phallus, and its first appearance in London nearly broke Victorian society. Before we go on, though, just a heads up. Corpse flower is a name that gets attached to a few different plants, including Rafflesia arnoldii and the ghostly North American Indian pipe. It's confusing, I know, but we'll have to save their stories for another day. As for our corpse flower, its story starts underground, where the real horror lives. The corpse flower belongs to the Araceae family, the aroids, a group that also includes other plants we've previously covered, like the alocasias and the Monstera deliciosa. Molecular studies, including a 2012 paper published in New Phytologist, suggest that the Amorphophallus lineage emerged roughly 24 million years ago during the Oligocene epoch, right as the massive tectonic shifts that shaped the Milesian region were getting underway. Members of the genus Amorphophallus first appear in the written record in 1692, in Dutch botanist Hendrik van Vred's Botanical Encyclopedia Hortus Malabaricus, though it would take until 1834 when Dutch botanist Carl Ludwig Bloom formally gave the genus its name. He called the genus Amorphophallus from the Greek for misshapen phallus, which was a reference to the distinctive shape of the spadix, that central spike that dominates the inflorescence, which means that long before anyone had formally described our specific plant, its entire genus was already named after an anatomical feature that would have scandalized every parlor in Europe. As for our corpse flower's specific origins, the only source I found is one sentence in a PDF from Cornell University suggesting it may date back to the late Cretaceous, potentially placing its ancestors alongside the last of the dinosaurs. While I typically trust stuff that comes out of Cornell's botanical research, I couldn't corroborate that anywhere, and their source isn't listed, so I just want to be transparent about that. Sadly, because these plants are soft and fleshy, they rot long before we can ever discover their fossils, leaving us with a giant gap in history, which means that for all we know about this plant, its origin story is still an open case. Corpse flower is endemic to the lowland rainforest and steep limestone hills of the Indonesian island of Sumatra. While the plant is truly impressive to look at and has the largest inflorescence we found in nature, the true engine of the plant is its corm, essentially a giant starchy tuber that can become ridiculously large. Most research says the corms average about 165 pounds, but a specimen at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh weighed over 340 pounds at maturity. So maybe there are even bigger specimens and we just haven't found them yet. For most of its life, the plant exists above ground as a single enormous leaf that can grow 20 feet tall. And that leaf has one job: photosynthesize constantly and push every gram of sugar it produces straight down into the underground battery. And the plant won't trigger a bloom until the corm hits a minimum threshold. Researchers have found it needs to reach at least 20 pounds before the bloom cycle can even begin. From there, it keeps charging for anywhere from 7 to 10 years, or sometimes longer if your plant is particularly prissy. Only when the corm decides it has accumulated enough energy does it trigger the bloom. And when it does, it commits completely, pulling up that tower of burgundy and green, generating its own heat and broadcasting that stench of death across half a mile of jungle to attract carrion flies and beetles who will spread its pollen. And this happens all within a 48-hour window. The corm can lose up to 40% of its weight in a single cycle, but if the bloom isn't pollinated, that decade of work is simply gone, and the whole process starts over. And while it's waiting, all those years of patient accumulation, the plant has another problem to solve. A corm that size and the single massive leaf feeding it are like a buffet for herbivores. So many Amorphophallus species, including the Titan Arum, have developed a quiet piece of trickery: irregular markings along the stem that mimic the appearance of lichen, making the whole structure look like an unappetizing woody tree trunk rather than something worth eating. And according to Yuzami, a leading corpse flower expert at the Center for Plant Conservation at the Bogor Botanic Gardens, some local people in Sumatra believe that those petiole markings resemble a snake, which is one of the several reasons they sometimes destroy the plant on site. But we'll get to that in a second. However, none of these survival tools prepared it for the most unpredictable threat of all, the people who live alongside it. The people of Sumatra know this plant as bunga bangkie, corpse flower, and its bloom is seen as an omen. According to Uzami, many people in rural Sumatra believe a person can be swallowed up by the plant. So, most parents won't allow their children to come too close, and the smell of decay only strengthens that fear. If a child goes quiet near it, the assumption is obvious. Some communities also associate the plant's markings with a fungal skin infection called tinea versicolor, believing they could catch it simply by being near the plant. These beliefs all have the same result. When people find it growing on their land, they destroy it. But not everyone fears it in the same way. In Kipa Iyang Regency, some people believe the petiole contains a sacred stone with the power to cure disease, though the plant is destroyed in an attempt to find it. It is a plant that has inspired reverence, fear, art, and destruction all at the same time. How much deeper the story runs, we honestly can't say. The written record in pre-colonial Sumatran relationships with bunga bangkai is frustratingly thin, and what survives is largely filtered through the accounts of Western travelers who arrived with their own frameworks already in place. So our trail picks back up in the Victorian era when an Italian botanist set off a chain of events that Victorian society was absolutely not prepared for. The year is 1878. An Italian botanist, Odoardo Beccari, has been chasing rumors. Somewhere in the rainforests of West Sumatra, locals spoke of a gigantic plant that dwarfed anything known to European botany. And after trekking through steep, mud-slicked ravines, he finally saw it. Standing before it for the first time, you think he just, took it all in, staring in awe. But instead, he did what any self-respecting 19th century botanist would do. He got out his measuring tape. The spadix alone reached nearly 6 feet, while the space, the ruffled outer wrap, was wide enough to hide a child. He documented everything with the clinical precision of a man trying very hard not to seem as shocked as he clearly was. Then he wrote up his findings in a paper he titled Un Piñata Maravillosa, a wonderful plant. Beccari named the species Amorphophallus titanum, dropping it squarely into that misshapen phallus genus from 1834. The titanum just meant giant. But the fun part of this is that naming it after a misshapen phallus was not an oversight. There's a little more subversion than you might imagine. Giving this plant a name that was technically Latin, technically scientific, and technically unprintable in a family newspaper, Beccari set a trap for the entire society. To report on this marvel, the press would have to either print the name and explain what it meant, or tie themselves into linguistic knots avoiding it. Beccari sent seeds back to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and the Botanical Garden of Florence, but the road from Sumatra to London was not kind to the specimens. The corms, massive, moisture-heavy, and utterly uninterested in surviving a months-long sea voyage, arrived as black fermented mush. Most of the original shipments were lost before they could be studied, and it wasn't until the seeds were successfully germinated at Kew that the West finally got its first look at what Beccari had found. And even then, they had to wait. A full decade passed before germination and the first bloom. When it finally happened, in June of 1889, it was so worth the wait. Hey, also, if you're fascinated by the kind of history that hides in plain sight and drives Victorians wild, subscribe now because this is exactly what the history of plants is built for. The response to that first Kew bloom was unlike anything the gardens had ever managed. Over 20,000 visitors descended in a single week. Transportation wasn't easy back then, but it was still so important and so amazing that it drew tens of thousands of people. Lines stretched into the London streets. Staff had to manage crowds that were simultaneously repulsed and astonished. People who would never utter the word phallus in a parlor were willing to stand for hours to be nauseated by the shape and stench of that thing they couldn't stop talking about, or couldn't talk about either. The press retreated into Latin, using its scientific name as a shield to describe the very alive spectacle of that towering spike, without having to explain the translation to their readers. Titan mania had arrived, and some might argue it never really left. By the late 19th century, sensationalist newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic were running accounts of man-eating plants lurking in the jungles of the East, vampire trees, carnivorous vines, botanical monsters that used moving tendrils to trap and consume humans. I cover a lot of that in my Alchemica Botanica episode about mythical plants, So check that out. Most, of course, were outright fabrications, but the indigenous stories of the corpse flower gave storytellers a direction to point to. A plant with a meat-colored interior, a smell of fresh death, legends of children going missing, and a shape that seemed to defy every European category of what a plant should be. It was impossible not to project something predatory onto it. And of course, the cadaver smell reinforced that. While the Victorians were busy being scandalized by the shape and the smell, scientists had a different obsession entirely, because underneath that spectacle of Titan mania was a question no one could answer. How can a plant germinate heat the way a living body can? The answer lies in a process called thermogenesis, heat generation. And the corpse flower is one of the most dramatic examples in the plant kingdom. During peak bloom, the spadix essentially behaves like a furnace, burning through the stored energy of the corm in a remarkable rate. Mitochondria in the spadix cells work overtime, metabolizing cellular starches and releasing heat as a byproduct. The same basic mechanism that keeps mammals warm, just without the muscles, the heart, or any of the other equipment we technically associate with warmth. During the process, the spadix can warm up as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient temperature of its surroundings. So for a plant sitting in the Sumatran rainforest, that's roughly human body temperature, and that's entirely the point, because the heat does two things. First, it creates a convection current that lifts scent compounds up and out of the space and into the surrounding air, dramatically extending the smell's range. Second, it mimics the warmth of a fresh carcass, because bodies stay warm for hours after death, and the insects the corpse flower is trying to attract have evolved over millions of years to detect exactly that combination of heat and smell as a signal that food and a breeding site are now available. But the chemistry of all of this is frankly impressive. Gas chromatography analysis of the corpse flower's bloom has identified a specific cocktail of sulfur-based compounds designed to mimic the smell of carrion with remarkable precision. Dimethyl trisulfide, the smell of rotting cabbage and decomposing protein; trimethylamine, rotting fish; isovaleric acid, sweaty feet and rancid cheese; indole, which in high concentrations smells unmistakably fecal, though in low concentrations is actually found in jasmine and orange blossom, like nature's little joke. And then there's putrescine and cadaverine, which are named with admirable scientific honesty exactly for what they smell like. G. Eric Schaller of Dartmouth College and his colleagues identified putrescine, a previously unknown component of this bouquet, confirming that the form produced by the corpse flower is chemically identical to that found of a decomposing animal tissue. In both cases, it's derived from the breakdown of specific amino acids, the building block of proteins. It's essentially replicating the chemistry of death. The scale of that replication, though, is truly staggering. Rose Russell, a PhD candidate at Colorado State University, and her colleagues measured the chemical emissions of a blooming corpse flower in 2024 and found that it was emitting sulfur compounds at rates comparable to those of landfills. A single plant, for a 48-hour window, producing a chemical output of industrial waste sites is crazy and arguably the most efficient olfactory deception in the natural world. Now, while we're in the chemistry section, if you've ever wondered whether you could eat one of these, the answer is first, what's wrong with you? And second, technically yes, with conditions. The corm contains calcium oxalate crystals, the same needle-like structures found throughout the aroid family, including plants like alocasia and Dieffenbachia that I've covered in previous episodes. Dieffenbachia sits at the severe end of that spectrum. Its stalks can cause intense burning, swelling, and in serious cases, breathing difficulties. Alocasia has landed people in the hospital with laryngeal edema. Amorphophallus titanum, meanwhile, sits on the lower end. The crystals will make your mouth extremely unhappy if you try eating it raw, but it doesn't produce severe systemic effects the way its more aggressive relatives can. Related Amorphophallus species like the elephant foot yam are actually cultivated as food crops across Southeast Asia, once properly processed to remove those crystals. Amorphophallus titanum itself is too rare and too slow growing to be a practical food source, but the chemistry is there, which brings us to a quieter crisis happening in the background of every botanical garden in the world. Almost every cultivated corpse flower in existence traces its genetic lineage back to seeds from Beccari's original 1878 collection. Over 140 years of cultivation from an extremely narrow genetic base has created a bottleneck in a population so genetically similar that it's increasingly vulnerable to disease, reduced vigor, and the compounding problems of inbreeding. The Chicago Botanic Garden recognized this and launched a coordinated genetic mapping project, creating a database of the genetic makeup of every known cultivated specimen and using it to guide cross-pollination between the most genetically distinct individuals. The goal is to ensure that the captive population, which may eventually be the only population, remains genetically healthy enough to survive. Because here's what the Roussel study found that didn't make the headlines. Polluted air can diminish the corpse flower's scent plume and alter its chemical profile. In theory, as air quality degrades around the remaining wild habitat in Sumatra, the plant's ability to attract its pollinators degrades with it, one bloom at a time. The numbers are stark. Fewer than 1,000 Amorphophallus titanum individuals are estimated to remain in the wild. And that number represents a decline of more than 50% over the last 150 years. To put that in perspective, in 1885, British naturalist Henry Ogg Forbes wrote in his book A Naturalist's Wanderings in the Eastern Archipelago that he was, quote, gratified to find abundance of the great arums, Amorphophallus titanum, with tubers of a greater size than any I had seen before. People already lived in rural Sumatra at the time. The forests were already inhabited, navigated, and understood, and there was still abundance. Whatever has happened since 1885 is not a story about inevitable loss, it's a story about specific choices. The primary culprit is deforestation, specifically the clearing of Sumatran rainforests for oil palm plantations and agricultural expansion. Amorphophallus titanum grows in a secondary forest, the kind of young recovering woodlands that form in the wake of a disturbance, and that habitat is disappearing at a rate the plant's reproductive cycle simply cannot match. Remember, this is a species that takes 7 to 10 years to produce a single bloom. It can't outpace a chainsaw. The other threat is harder to see, but it's just as damaging. Indonesian researchers have documented corms being harvested illegally and piled up for sale, prized for their high glucomannan content, the same dietary fiber used as a thickening agent in Japanese cooking, and increasingly marketed as a weight loss supplement in the West. And then there's the hornbill problem. The rhinoceros hornbill is the primary disperser of Amorphophallus titanum seeds. It eats the bright berries and carries the seeds through the forest. But trophy hunting and habitat destruction are pushing hornbill populations into decline, and when the hornbills go, the plant's ability to reproduce and spread goes with them. It's a decline that's happening quietly while the rest of the world is watching a live stream.
Speaking of which, every time a corpse flower blooms in a botanical garden, the world briefly loses its mind. The U.S. Botanic Garden's 2017 bloom drew more than 130,000 visitors in person,
over 650,000 viewers via live stream. Gardens extend their hours, set up 24-hour stink cams, hold naming contests, Dame Judy Stench, Pepe Le Pew, Morticia, Putrescine, amongst others, and watch their social media engagement spike to levels most institutions would only dream about. In a way, there's something genuinely moving about the collective human response to a plant that smells like death. It's a shared experience and something rare, fleeting, and utterly ridiculous, but I say that with love. Titan mania, it turns out, is not a Victorian phenomenon. It's a permanent condition. If you want to understand how deep that condition runs, consider this. In 1995, Sir David Attenborough was filming his landmark BBC series, The Private Life of Plants, and needed to feature Amorphophallus titanum. The problem was the name. Amorphophallus, giant misshapen phallus, was, in the BBC's considered opinion, too rude for television audiences. So Attenborough coined a new common name on the spot. Titan Arum, a literal translation of the Latin, scrubs its anatomical specificity and made it safe for prime time. Over a century after Beccari set his trap for Victorian journalists, the same plant forced the same compromise, this time from one of the most celebrated naturalists in broadcasting history. But the plant won again. But here's the uncomfortable reality that sits beneath it all. The corpse flower is arguably the most famous plant on Earth. It has a fan base, merchandising presence, social media following, and the most famous naturalist in broadcasting history as its champion. But it's still disappearing. But there are reasons for a cautious level of hope. Botanical gardens worldwide are coordinating pollination efforts, tracking individual plants by name, and working to broaden the genetic base of captive populations. In Sumatra, younger generations are increasingly embracing ecotourism around wild blooms, recognizing that a living corpse flower on your land is worth more as an attraction than as a pile of harvested corms. The plant has been designated as a conservation flagship species in Indonesia, which brings both legal protections and cultural visibility. And the same celebrity that makes it a punchline also makes it a symbol, something people can feel personally connected to and invested in protecting. Whether that's enough is an open question. We have always been better at preserving the spectacle than the ecosystem it came from. The corpse flower has survived tens of millions of years of tectonic upheaval, colonial extraction, Victorian scandal, and BBC editing decisions. Whether it can survive us is part of the story still being written. I'm Megan Rame. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The History of Plants, and massive thanks to Uzami for taking the time to answer my questions. Jump into the commentary for this episode on Patreon to hear what got left out, or if you're ready to meet another plant that evolved an equally outrageous survival strategy, check out my episode on the Venus flytrap, nature's perfect predator that was once considered heresy. Until next time, greenies, stay curious and don't forget to flourish.